For those of you, welcome back to Detection Dispatch, the podcast for practitioners who live and breathe detection engineering. I'm Alex, your host, and today we are starting this lineup in 2025 super strong with a very special guest, as you may have heard by now. For those of you that tuned with us last year, you know that we talk a lot about what's broken, what's maybe bad, like bad detections, what makes alerts so noisy, right? Burnout even we've talked about. But what about like those engineers that just kind of get it right? What are those habits that separate high performers from the rest? We're going to shed some light on some of the positives this time. So to answer that, we've got none other than Zack Allen joining us. You probably know him from Detection Engineering Weekly or Datadog. He puts together these incredibly curated content, like a weekly digest of what we're reading or what we should be reading, highlights of what's happening in our space, and with an over 11,000 following and subscribers. So Zack, applauding you in every way. Thank you for coming
Thank you.
on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
And also, we're going to have some sneak peeks at our detection engineering report stats, which you, Zack, have also helped us contribute and really shape a lot of the questions. And for those of you that don't know, our detection engineering initiative, it's a report and survey that we're giving back to the community, right? Ungated, you were such a big part of that. So we really appreciate you.
I am really excited to see that it got great engagement. And yes, I did get the sneak peek as well. And there's so much to talk about. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you kick us off then, Zack, for our listeners? What originally drew you to the space, to detection and engineering, to data science? What keeps you so passionate about what you're doing and maybe what you're working on lately?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in security probably close to 15 years at this point. I studied at Rochester Institute of Technology, which has a lot of security programs there. What I've basically fallen into time and time again in my career is that I wanted the deep technical problem set that security research can offer. What I've noticed is that I really like a changing environment. So that was almost perfect for studying the threat landscape. We had SIMs back then and different ways to look at logs. I worked a lot on web application firewalls as well. The thing that kept me engaged over and over again is that someone would get past something. And I really wanted that same attacker mindset of getting past something I put up and how can I challenge that to continue to evolve. I also just got a lucky break that almost every job I've landed full time, I was working on a product and trying to distill these concepts down to something a customer or prospect would understand. And I just like that building component, that aha moment that people got. So that led me from Department of Defense to a startup called ZeroFox to Fastly, a content delivery network, back to ZeroFox, and then finally at Datadog, where I help run the detection engineering and security research arm here. So a lot of really fun problem sets to deal with, but I've always been rooted in what are the bad guys doing and how can I understand as much as possible about them.
Yeah, I can assure you that this field and there's no 2 days that are the same. To be a problem solver is so important for a field that's changing constantly. It's almost like an everyday puzzle.
It is. It's almost like trash TV in some ways too, because there's always feels like there's a dumpster fire. Some person did something somewhere and we didn't even think about this before, and now we got to drop everything and work on it. So it's very episodic in that way. Maybe I'm comparing and contrasting it to like, those different reality TV shows.
I'm chronically online and I don't know why. It's almost like a hate watch. I know how bad it sucks, but you just almost can't stop.
Exactly. That's right.
No, but I love how you articulated that. Just breaking down all of what we deal with, very complex problems in SecOps, and being able to simplify, articulate, and solve it is such a talent, a great skill to have. I've always said, if you can't explain something very clearly, you likely don't understand it yourself. So it's the
Right.
clear communication of that is also so key.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And one thing that has really motivated me here too is that light bulb that goes off with people when they go, I understand now. You could do that with very technical people on your team. Maybe you're teaching them a new concept or a new data source, but you can also do that with people outside of your team. I've found a lot of success trying to do this for business leaders and customers, prospects, whatever it is. Folks that don't have that internal knowledge, but still kind of understand what you're trying to do. A really good piece of advice I got was treat all your customers and prospects like your grandparents, treat them well
Oh,
and be patient with
yeah.
them. And once they get it, you're really happy because you love them because they're your grandparents.
Flashbacks to my grandma calling me because I keep forgetting her Facebook password. But yeah, you
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
just take a deep breath and do it again.
I think people appreciate that too, right? And so we're all just trying to operate on information asymmetry. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is someone may not have all the information you do. And of course,
Right.
this translates well to detection, right? And so how
Right.
can we level set is what makes it interesting.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of level setting and skills and good traits, what I want to do with you, Zach, is just break down those good traits, those good skills, those green flags and mindsets that define
Hmm.
really what we want for in the detection in your detection engineering team. You probably run teams of detection engineers. So, listeners, if you're looking to level up, or maybe if you want to confirm if you're on the right track, this one's going to be for you. You're going to want to really stay for the rest of the episode. For those of you that are here live, you get to ask Zach some questions at the end of the. And for those tuning in on Spotify, we hope you enjoy, follow, and rate the show. So let's get into it. I'm going to distinguish or differentiate really to level set. What is a red flag? What is a green flag? It may be pretty straightforward for some, but maybe not. I was telling my mom about it and she was like, "What is that?" But I think it came from probably the dating experience. And Zach, you probably have been out of it for a while. And I kind of have too, but I do remember it chronically and I'm talking about it with my girlfriends all the time. Red flags are very clear warning signs that something is off, something is problematic. You're probably going to be running into some problems, in whatever common goal that you're doing, right? Whether it's a team or in dating. I feel like the list for red flags is growing collectively from when I used to see it to now. There's like list and list and list on iPhone notes, like of what red flags are I've seen. But like examples are being like obviously very being mean to the staff, any kind of
Hmm.
staff. Super red flag there. Or having a hard time dealing with no, right? When you can't absolutely compromise, probably like only child, so don't never learned how to share. Just yeah, if you don't know how to not get your way, sometimes that's problematic. Or one I saw recently in a movie, within the first 5 minutes of this love interest meeting, they were kicking things like chairs and everything, punching walls. I'm like, okay, as an adult, if you can't manage your anger without kicking things, that's kind of a red flag. Positive traits. So green flag, complete opposite, right? So
Hmm.
behaviors that show someone is going to positively contribute towards whatever common goal you have. They're worth investing in. It's going to be a pleasant experience. We stand for the green flags, like listening to understand. I love when people really understand something, not just listen to reply.
Right.
Love the green flags. Something that has emerged recently, though, I don't know if you've seen this, but we have beige flags, which they're not necessarily bad, but they're like this kind of neutral ground where it's kind of odd, but not necessarily a deal breaker. And
You can go
researching the
either way,
episode,
basically. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I researched some things that could be beige flags. Having those pretty much distinguished now, Zach, what do you think? What makes a high performing detection engineer? What are the top traits that you look for in those engineers that excel?
Some green flags, perhaps.
Yeah, green
Um,
flags.
okay. The natural thing to talk about is technical proficiency. I have a probably more opinionated take on detection engineers when it comes to technical proficiency. I
Mhm,
always like to tell folks I look for T's. So you have a deep expertise in something,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
Let's just say it's Windows or let's just say it's cloud or anything like that. But if that's all you're an expert in, it's going to be really hard to translate that to what we deal with as detection engineers. So
Yeah.
I look for someone who's engaged and interested in other parts of maybe the stack they're interacting with. They know how to
Yeah.
use it. they know how to fix things, but their bread and butter is something along those lines. So I try to avoid I's and stick with T's, let's just say with that. Making sure that, I talk about the research ivory tower where you have a research team at a company or organization, they go up in their ivory tower. You don't hear from them because they're doing crazy black magic up there. They're hacking something. They come down, they say, we did this awesome thing. Look at how smart we are. Then they go back up and you don't hear
Oh.
from them again. I don't want anyone that lives in that ivory tower
Mm.
because they need to be on the ground with us.
Yeah.
You
They're
leveraging
not
the
really a team
expertise.
player. They're not really a team
Exactly.
player. Hmm.
I need that expertise, but I also need you to spread the love, to have people learn through osmosis, to understand that it's more than just this deep technical problem we're trying to solve.
That is such a good one. As soon as you started explaining that, I immediately can think of a few people that are like that. I also think along that realm too, it's difficult working with people that are overly cautious. A good healthy level of skepticism is obviously great for the software
Right.
stuff, for our industry, but almost too much delays a lot of progress in terms of execution.
There is a personality for that, and I do see maybe it is a beige flag for me. Like, how do I harness this correctly?
Mm.
But what could go wrong is that chronic no sare, like you said. And so when I see that in a team or an org, my biggest feedback for them is like figure out how to say yes straight up. Figure out as
Yeah.
much as you can to say yes, because if you go through the mental exercise of, all right, let's just assume we are doing this. Like, what's the best way to do it? Even if that person still feels like they need to say no, they kind of arrive at a compromise or they arrive at something where they're like, okay, it makes sense to do it this way. I'm going to put these guardrails up, or I'm going to check in on this in a certain way. And
Hmm.
then they gain a little bit of trust. And it's those little inklings, 1% plus of trust that eventually builds up into more of a high performing person.
Absolutely. I think that also goes along with listening to understand. Like, if you just gave a little bit more window of time to see what we're trying to get at here, like, we're on the same team. What are you
Yeah.
optimizing for? Just thinking about how they're approaching the problem versus what the other person cares about. I just recently saw, like, in the Radical Condor book, it's like if we're constantly in disagreement with people, it's probably because you're just not understanding what's on their mind, what they want, they're trying to achieve. And once that
Yep.
is out there, it's so much easier to work together, even if you do disagree with the person.
I'm glad you read Radical Candor. I have it on the other side of this wall, actually, in my
Oh yeah.
bookcase. I like it a lot because it really does get to the point of like, how can you trust somebody implicitly? And it really, the term I look for is just assuming positive intent, right? And
Yeah.
so making sure that we talk about trash fires and trash TV in detection,
Uh-huh.
it's really hard to always be in a heightened state of mind. You add that complexity on top of difficult decision making,
Mm,
it can turn ugly quickly. So by assuming
sure can.
positive intent, by trying to understand, like you said from that book, you'd be surprised. I'm always trying to challenge my bias in this perspective as well. I could tell you something this week that has probably happened where I had to do that. You feel more mindful and better afterwards. You don't make it worse. And it's the making it worse is where I've noticed in my career that I've had to tamper down.
Absolutely. I'm still thinking about what you said, the T or T. I think that's
Yes.
something that does come up a lot in the SOC, but also could be, I feel like, could be referred to as being a jack of all trades. This is coming up constantly by a lot of security leaders like Jake
Yep.
Malware and Spencer. Like, being a jack of all trades in the SOC, it's incredibly useful, but like you said, it narrows your efforts to push results, right? You may be good at many things, but trying to engage everything at once seems like total chaos. And Dr. Julie Gerner, she's like, if you do one thing at a time really well and others will really kind of recognize you for it, you're going to end up being the go-to person for that.
Yes, yeah. This reminds me of this pretty well-known blog post in the software engineering space called glue work.
Hmm.
And the problem, and they define glue work as very similar to this. You're a jack of all trades. Maybe you're good at documentation, some alerting, team meetings, you're good at follow-ups and action items. But when it comes to you being measured on your performance, it doesn't translate one to one with that technical proficiency. This happens often in the software world with folks that approach the project management of software engineering. When they
I
get to the
see.
performance management, you're like, hey, how much, let's just say code have
Yeah.
you committed, or how many features have you
Right.
shipped?
How do you
And
quantify
so
what you just did?
it's hard to say all of these little things add up to something big only because the expectations are different with the job description. So be curious, introduce yourself to many things, and maybe you approach that jack of all trades. But I like to tell folks entering this field, like, go deep on something and
Yeah.
be the person that when this kind of problem comes up, technically, you're that go to person.
hmm But also, this residency thing, right? Like being able to understand many different roles within the SOC, or this having residencies, right, across many
Hmm.
different areas, and figuring it out and trialing and error. It just
Yeah.
makes you more well-rounded. Are not good at it, you find yourself that you suck at it. That's
Hmm.
fine. That
Hmm.
really is okay. The best way to learn is trial and error, especially when it comes to detections.
Right.
That's the best way to tune stuff because it turns out to be broken.
Yeah, and you hope to be in an environment where you can lean on folks to introduce you to those new concepts. After you finish Radical Candor, there's a book called The Diversity Equation. The basic
Okay.
premise behind it is you can get everyone to arrive at the same point. Let's just say becoming a detection engineer. But the real value
Uh-huh.
is the paths and the various paths that got to that point. They talk about examples, everything between cultural boundaries to class boundaries. But really, what it comes down to is like when you have employments like we do, where it's very thought intensive academic intensity, it's really good to have different styles of detection engineers or
Um,
security engineers that came from
yeah.
different parts. I've worked
Yeah.
with folks that have PhDs that weren't really that technical, and several people that dropped out of high school and college that are most technical people I've ever met. People that have grown up in certain parts of a city that are extremely driven, that immigrant mentality as well. All of those things together, as long as you get to that end point, that detection engineer, that is what really makes that healthy org, is what I've noticed. So lean on folks for all that and more when it comes to exploring the different fields here.
I love their unique perspective that they can bring to a problem yeah, I could see that, having such a huge impact.
Exactly, exactly.
The another thing is back on the technical expertise. Would you prefer someone who is more on the techie side, or maybe isn't, but is, a critical thinker, is a problem solver, but may not be as techie? Is there a type of persona you prefer?
It depends on when I'm hiring and where I'm hiring. So, a lot of times when it comes to building a team, timing matters. When I first booted up this org, I needed very technical people, and
Uh-huh.
I needed people that were a little bit scrappy, that maybe came from environments where either it's a startup or they were resource limited. That's
Mm,
only because where we were, it felt like a startup. Now, with a much more mature org, I'm looking at folks that can bring a different approach to things. We want them to be technical. We can give them the training, but I'm
yeah.
very interested in things like drive. I'm very interested in the voice of the customer. I'm very interested in things
Mm,
like how do I manage stakeholders to make them work for us so we can scale things out. I think timing does matter in this particular scenario.
yeah, in your hiring periods. And
Yeah.
also on that, oh, we have a question, it looks like. Mahesh, please feel free to ask.
Hey Zach, I have one question. In 2025, we have the new year going on. What should be the new trends we're gonna be using in our enterprise companies for
Mhm.
detection engineering? And especially, I'm talking about you have lots of fantastic experience about detection engineering. How do we get your experience on a platform like, yeah, you right now on Zoom, that's fine. But any platform do you have so that we're going to get your latest things we're gonna getting update ourselves all the time.
Sure. Great question. Never ask a person that works for a product company what the best platform is. But on a more serious note, what I'm seeing, at least in the detection engineering industry, a couple of things. I think folks are really starting to take notes from SRE, DevOps, and software engineering, and they're trying to push the bounds of what it means to have like things like detection as code. And so what
Mm,
I'm starting to see more of is, hey, like I don't want to ever enter your UI to update your code because there's a lot of governance problems behind that. It's almost like updating production without having any CI/CD, right? And so you'll see a lot of trends right now, and I'm reading blog posts and things like that on how can we get that SRE like experience and DevOps experience for code related to our detections. That's one of them. In terms of platforms, the platform play is always an interesting concept in security. It waxes and wanes from point solutions to platforms. So to speak in general terms, we are going to see a lot more large language model AI type of approaches to this. I talked with one customer and they're moving from one platform to another, right? Instead of rewriting anything, they're just like, I throw the language at OpenAI, ChatGPT, and it spits out something else. That scares me because it means like how much validation goes into this. But I think that is going to be really interesting with product solutions and open source coming out with ways to solve problems like that. So I hope that answers your question. My newsletter perspective, I'm seeing a lot of content just on those two things right now.
Seems like he wants like Detection
Thank you.
Engineering Weekly as a platform.
That would be nice. Maybe I can throw an
Could
LLM
that
at
be
it.
in the works? Could that be in the
It
works?
could be. That's my startup. I'll turn it into a newsletter platform thing that you can use.
Back to some of the scripting languages, how important it is for someone to be like an SPL, SQL, insert whatever QL scripting language useful, expert for them to be in the SOC. I'm sure having a well-rounded diversity of
Yeah.
roles, like you said, but at the same time, the growth mindset is the most important part because of the drive
Yes.
to adapt to the different things required to balance out to people's strengths on the team, people's weaknesses on the team, and just really plan or adapting for that is much, much, I would say, better than someone who is, let's say, an SQL expert.
I think for me, let's go back to the tea analogy here. When you become an expert at one specific thing, you can really base your learning afterwards by drawing and comparing and contrasting between that. So let's just say you are an SPL expert or you're on Datadog Sim or whatever it is. As long as you have a deep understanding of that, that growth mindset helps you learn other things. A great example of this as well as programming languages. If you become deep in any one programming language, it tends to just be a lot easier to pick up other things. And so rigidity can matter in some concepts within detection, but that open mind that you talked about, Alex, of like, listen, we may need to adjust, we may need to pick something else up. It's a lot easier when you can say, I'm just going to rely on my experience with this, and I'm going to try my best to say like, oh, that's different compared to SPL, or this is different compared to Sigma, or maybe it's the same and it's a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, I find that the best habits are very consistent with those who have this growth mindset. I find that people that have growth mindsets tend to see problems and de-escalate them without even you having to ask them to do that for anything that is needed. They don't wait for permission. That can go volumes because we don't have a lot of time, right, in
No,
SecOp.
we don't. To kind of bring back to the start of the show, maybe you can let people know in reality TV shows they need a growth mindset because none of them have a growth mindset.
Not at all. But you know what they do have? They champion each other's ideas. They support each other's decisions, even if they're bad decisions.
They're good friends.
I do like that. I do like when people champion others, especially in my house. We talk a lot about introverts and extroverts. So I'm obviously a very, very extrovert, but my partner, he's very introvert. And I feel like I vote and some friends in my circle too. And I feel like it's an extrovert's kind of responsibility to bring in and, probably be like, oh, well, what do you think about this? Because I don't know if they will necessarily jump on the opportunity to talk on their own. It's kind of our duty to do that, right?
And back to the diversity of thought kind of perspective, you'd just be surprised how people listen to folks that don't speak as much because when they speak, it's almost always like, oh, damn, that is spot on. And so to really pull that out of somebody is worth it because there are people that prefer to not speak until they have something really relevant to say, as opposed to someone that is constantly interjecting, if that makes sense.
That's true. The loudest person in the room isn't always the smartest, but boy, can we hear them all the time. Another thing too is I don't know I don't know if this fits with growth mindset, but I just thought about it. I think it's a green flag to self-awareness, like basically be planted in any situation and knowing just how to read the room.
Yes.
When to contribute, when to not contribute. Sometimes if you have something to say, but it's not going to really move the needle, is it even worth bringing up?
That takes practice, I've noticed. And I'm actually working on that right now. I like the term mindfulness a lot. I got the Headspace app and I'm trying to do more of that. I have gotten training on this at business school, making sure that you're aware of the power structures inside your organization and meetings. You can notice when somebody else is employing certain powers. For example, when I'm in a meeting, I count the last time I spoke. I do it in my head. So I'm like, about 4 or 5 people have spoken or taken turns speaking. Maybe it's my turn. If I'm breaking that rule, being mindful of like, oh, I'm speaking too much. Let me pull in this person. Hey, Alex, what do you think about this? And I can at least pay dues that I spoke too much and I bring somebody else in.
Wow, what a self-aware king. Look at that.
I mean, it took years. It took years. So
No, we love to see that. That's such an
yeah.
active listening and multitasking technique. I mean,
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people in security and in the SOC were information processors and we're very fast at it. So we actually, our skill sets benefit really well into those types of training and skills of whatever it's mindfulness or just kind of being aware and multitasking. So it's worked out. I just wish, as most people do, I probably started a little bit sooner in my life.
yeah. No, that is
So,
wonderful advice. That is wonderful advice for our listeners.
yep.
The very last thing I'll add to the good habits, green flags, is back to what you were talking about in the beginning. It's like not putting the guardrails up front so much and saying no. If someone embraces change with a positive mindset, especially
Yes.
because it's changing so much, there's no 2 days that are the same. It's not taking this change in direction as something completely derailing and being so upset about it. It's okay that things are changing. Change could very much be the only constant.
Yeah, it's being comfortable. And again, like I've noticed in my life and maybe after having very small children, I'm really starting to notice is that you have to be comfortable. In order to do that, it just takes practice and you have to get reps in. So
Yeah.
if I had to give any advice on it is get those reps in when it's not a crisis situation. Like practice in small things. Hey, we're moving stand up to here. We're this new time. We're using GitHub instead of GitLab. Like those things, I feel like don't evoke any or really crazy emotions. But when it's like, oh my gosh, incident, like everyone wipe everything off your calendar, get a pot of coffee because we're gonna stay late. I feel like if you practice 10 small things before that, it limits the impact of like that emotional intensity from something really large.
I'm reminded of the Pareto principle where
Mm-hmm.
when do 20% of your efforts net, you have 80% of the results. In other words, if you're an expert in something, you focus on information in correlation to growth rather than starting from scratch with everything.
Yeah, I love the Pareto principle. It's so relevant in statistics and applies really well in detection. So, just maybe as a thought exercise for folks listening, look at false positive, true positive ratio, your MTTRs, and the rules. You'll probably notice that 20% of your roles is taking up 80% of your work. It's a thing that just happens a lot in life. Another example, not detection related, is 20% of the population holds 80% of the wealth. It evens out to that almost constantly. I totally agree with that. Making sure that, and if you flip it, 80% of your work is on 20% of something really critical. It just translates nicely to that growth mindset that Alex is talking about.
And speaking of statistics and
Here we
metrics,
go. Yeah, I just I softball, like boom, right there. So
literally. I pulled a preview from our 2025 detection engineering report, the state of it, of the industry. This is an initiative that we've been working on. We've got over 200 participants that are detection engineers or do detection engineer like things, even if it's not necessarily their titles. And we've contributed or we compiled some data points that really reflects a lot of the core activities, what they like, what they don't like, how often they're spent on the core of their work. So I think we could go through some of these and think about the skills we talked about and how they relate. At the top left here, we've got this tuning. How often are they updating their detection rules, their detection processes? And it looks like the majority of them, they're doing it on a daily and weekly basis. But yet this morning, I was talking with Chaz about this. They also reported that even though that is what they're spending their, they're doing this so much, it's also reported like that's what they enjoy doing the least. And it's kind of a shitty thing to have. I mean, that's like
yeah.
the majority of your job and it's what you least want to be doing.
Yes, yeah. And like it kind of plays nicely into the stats below, right? Of building and maintaining. Those are the challenges, resources and time constraints. Do you want to update all the time or work on really interesting projects? And go back to the Pareto principle, right? Is like how much
Yeah,
of your work is spent on like 20% of the problem children, which is your detection rules, right? And
that's right.
so how can you build and scale something like that so you can reduce that cost is a huge area of concern for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And the skills, some of the skills we talked about and some of the skills that they reported that are needed, most valuable in detection engineering, they're saying that they currently see that understanding MITRE, understanding attack, right?
Hmm.
That's very consistent, that's very obvious, and but also understanding kind of how to go about your investigations, your threat assessment, responding to events, this intuition of knowing kind of what to do, and then
Hmm.
a query language, right, of some sort, or some kind of processing language that'll enable you to build a rule, right? The most detection engineers reported that these are some areas and skills that need the most work. Threat modeling
Yes.
being the highest, threat modeling, data engineering. So the normalizing, the parsing, like getting all of the data even ready for a detection, even to apply. Till this day, I mean, 10 years later, we're still talking about that.
It's always going to be a problem. Someone says there's too many standards. We need one standard to fix everything. And then we have yet another standard. It's not easy. I also find it interesting kind of looking left to right. It's a lot of what's on the right is going to help almost everything on the left. So,
Yeah.
like threat modeling, for example, what makes it, I think, hard for folks is expertise. Do they know everything that they need to know
Yeah.
about a system or a group of systems or an architecture or microservices? If they don't know it, how can they threat model or how can they build detections against it, right? I
Hmm.
see engineering as three of the five parts of the needs development, right? I've always been that proponent of software engineering. It gives you an amazing basis for almost everything else. I
Ah,
remember saying this on Twitter, and I got some Twitter crew like basically started replying to me saying like security people don't need software engineering. All you need to know is how the hackers work, and I
no
write
way.
stuff and get by just fine. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we're doing great now. But if you like what you're seeing is these tools and techniques emerging where you need a more fundamental understanding of the architectures you're working in. That's just a
Mhm.
really good basis to have at your disposal when you need to use it.
Absolutely. And especially because we're seeing that more companies are investing in detection engineers as they're building out their programs and filling in more roles. This is only going to shed more light on the problem. Hoping to redo a lot of the reports next and get even more detection engineers to
Yeah.
contribute. Some two memorable quotes I saw relevant, especially with the tuning piece, is this Fun Fridays aspect from Nathan Burns over at Autodesk. And yes, you got to do what you got to do kind of at the SOC. And there's competing priorities, and you know, you must do 80% of what must be done, right? But they also are finding time like on Fridays to do some of the more creative, more fun things. Like at Autodesk, they're holding Fun Fridays where they get together, they pause all other operational tasks and
Hmm.
focus on something that they consider fun, testing a detection idea, deploying a new detection, or researching a potential new attack path, which they've seen such an improvement in morale.
Hmm. We call them Futz Fridays for futzing around at Datadog. So
Oh, look at that.
yeah, it's important. And, at the end of the day, all of us are security researchers and
Yeah.
research being the key part here. So to have curious minds and to exercise that muscle is really important. I also noticed the two folks you put on here, I've quoted their work a lot on my newsletter. So
AVV. Yeah, AVV
yep.
is the other one about
Yes.
he
Yeah.
comments on the threat modeling aspect, who by the way, AVV will be coming on the podcast for a second round in a couple of weeks in February, talking about Kuba roasting, traversing models, reversing the model. Like, I'm a little bit intimidated by it, but stay tuned for that episode. On the threat modeling aspect, it's so important to threat modeling is very difficult to do by just anyone. It takes even he's 20 years at it, and it's even difficult for him. But
Hmm.
the feedback loop aspects with that consist of the juniors, the senior, DEs and analysts, like that's so going to be so important to build to be a part of that exercise, especially bringing in the purple team, their threat intel team, your DEs, the your IR team. Like this feedback loop in the SOC is so important. I think there was another question in the report about like how integrated is the DE team with some of these other very relevant groups, and the results were they're not as integrated as we'd like to think, and that's so critical for exercising.
It's critical just for day-to-day work. I tell my team the SOC is your customer.
Yeah.
So they're the ones dealing with a bad alert. Being connected at the hip, feeling their pain, understanding what works and doesn't work is really important, because if you have a firewall up between both of you and you're throwing stuff over the wall, it's just a bad spot to be in, right? Especially if you're on the other side of it. It's kind of like getting a car and realizing that the steering wheel doesn't work, right? And so why drive this and why use any of these detections if it's not even relevant or useful to me?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also, I'm thinking a lot about you as a leader, Zach, like all of these skills we talked about, right? We have Fun Fridays, all these skills that need development that they have, threat modeling, all of this kind of requires leaders like you to create a safe space for them to bring their best self to work, to bring out these skills, to feel comfortable in sharing
Right.
something that is not going so well. How would you, as a leader, help contribute to an environment where they feel empowered to take ownership of their detections, to take accountability? How do we go about that as leaders?
Yeah, I think modeling the behavior, I'm going to lean on my experience. I'm now learning with children is probably the best thing you can do. And also just kind of showing that you're human and that, like, here's a mistake that I ran into. So, an example of modeling the behavior, we steal a lot from SRE and DevOps. We have blameless culture. I might jump into something that I screwed up because I try to jump into incidents as much as I can and say, hey, look, this didn't really go so well. Let's look at and let's figure out why that happened. And to kind of be at the end of that, saying, I'm the person that did it, it makes everyone feel like, okay, this person may have positional power over me, but they're doing a good job of showing what they're going to do to fix it. And that shows like that maturity, but it also kind of shows that psychological safety that people work with. So that's one of them. The other one too is just a culture of feedback, and very structured feedback in the sense that it is not about just negative or constructive feedback. So
Yeah.
here's the situation, here's the behavior I observed, here is the impact, and here is what I think you need to do to adjust, or nice work. I even say those things out loud to somebody. I think people appreciate that a little bit more because everyone's had bad bosses. Everyone has gotten those performance reviews and got completely blindsided by something you've never even heard before. It's awful. I hate it.
It is.
Feedback should not be a surprise. Or if it is, it has to be as close to the event as possible.
As someone whose love language is words of affirmation, I can't stress enough how great it is to be told that you're doing a great job, that went well, thank you for doing that. It just makes you want to keep doing it again even more. It's so important, feedback in good times and in bad times. I absolutely love that.
I also ask people, how do you want to receive positive feedback? Do you like me shouting it with an @ here on Slack in front of everybody? Would you prefer I say it on our one-on-one Zoom so it's more personal? Would you prefer a quick Slack message? And so just being able to understand even how people take positive feedback is an important thing.
Absolutely. And it looks like we're at the top of the hour, very close to the end of our segment. I always like to ask Zach it's the traditional episode closing questions, and I think this one is going to be great for you. I always like to ask, what do you love most about the SecOps community, like big community following? You're a big part of that community. What do you love most about it? But also, what would you like to see more of, and that it's kind of lacking?
What I love the most about this community is the sharing of knowledge. I think that's probably shown a lot in my newsletter, but it's not even blog posts. It's cold reach outs to people saying, how did you do that? Can you show me? And more often than not, I get someone saying like, yeah, go read this, or let's jump on a Zoom, let's figure it out. I feel like the culture of learning is very special in security because at the end of the day, it's all about that experience, that learned experience that people have. You can read as much, listen to as much things as possible, but hearing a story from a learned experience is like the best. And that's how I like to learn. I'm a big storyteller. My team makes fun of me, calling me like chief storyteller and things like that. There is resistance that I've noticed to acknowledging that this problem has been solved before in security. And it's been solved somewhere else. And I think sometimes what security happens to do is that we'll come up with a thing. Threat emulation is a great example. It's regression testing. And that's been in software engineering for decades, and which is fine. And I'm not going to be that person that calls it out. But I think sometimes we forget that a lot of the access that security companies get and a lot of the products that we use on a day-to-day, they rely very heavily on really smart people that have been doing this for years and years and years. Let's just say that when someone comes up with a thing and they're refusing to acknowledge that this has been done before, just in a different context. So maybe we could coach it out of them, or maybe I should just let that one go.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of compromise is deciding when and when not to react to something, to pursue something. Is it the time? Yeah.
I 100% agree with that. And that's very appropriate for life too, isn't it?
Well, I do want to be respectful of your time, Zach. This has been such a wonderful episode, and the questions we got throughout were great. We've got people fanboying in the comments. They're saying that they are a huge fan of your newsletter, and they're already looking forward to newsletter number 100.
100. We're triple digits starting next week. Yep.
That's wild. Isn't that wild?
It's weird because it's tied to a week. So thinking of doing this for 100 weeks is pretty wild.
We're on episode 40, so we've got ways to go.
Yeah, you'll
Definitely
get there.
more. Well, listeners, that is a wrap on this episode of Detection Dispatch. Big thanks to Zach for bringing all this heat, all this content. And if there's one takeaway that we can get from this episode, is that, you know, high performing detection engineers really consist of a group of folks that are creative, they're problem solvers, they're not just writing detections, they're thinking super critically, they're collaborating effectively, they can communicate it effectively. And that's what we're all about on Dispatch. That's what Zach is all about on Detection Engineering Weekly. So if you've got something out of this episode, make sure you share it with your team and orbit it around on LinkedIn. And if you haven't already, definitely follow our show. And Zach, until next time, you're always welcome here on Dispatch. I hope to collaborate.
Thank you.
And keep learning from you. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your week.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, Zach.